Hey folks, Tyler here. So today I want to talk about AWS Identity Access Management. And the reason for this is I've interviewed a lot of engineers over the years, and IAM is something that's fuzzy for a lot of folks. And for good reason. It's really complicated. But here's the thing, as cloud security professionals, this is arguably the most important thing when it comes to cloud security. So I want to use this video today just to dive into AWS Identity Access Management and hopefully give you a clearer understanding of how it all works. So let's go ahead and get into it. We are going to have a couple different identity types in here. And so one of those identities is users. So we have users, and then we can also have groups, and then we can also have roles. Right, so those are basically the three types of identities within AWS IAM. So let's go ahead and deep dive into this. So I'm going to take users here, and let's discuss what a user is. Now, a user is used for human level access or application access. Right now, optionally, users can have access to the AWS console. And they do this with a username password. And then this is optional. Our users don't have to have access to the console. And then we also have access keys. So this is programmatic access. So we can use access keys for things like the CLI or coding and scripting. And these are also optional as well. Users don't have to have access keys. Now, if we think about this for a minute here, these are our credentials. And so this is what allows us to authenticate. So this is the authentication piece. This is validation of who we are. And we prove that by using a valid username and password or valid access keys. All right, so let's dive a little bit deeper into authentication here. So when we authenticate to the as an IAM user, we're hitting this API endpoint called IAM Amazon AWS.com. And so you can see this like in the CLI or if you're like digging into the code and stuff. But when we authenticate to AWS as an IAM user, we're going to hit this IAM API endpoint. Now this endpoint is only in US East 1. So the IAM service exists only in US East 1. Now, after we authenticate, next comes authorization. So basically validation of what we are allowed to do in AWS as this user. So let's talk about how a user is authorized to do things. So within AWS, we have this concept of IAM policies. Policies are basically permissions. All right. And so this is our authorization. Validation of what we can do. All right. So that's basically a user. We got human level access, application access. We do that optionally with the AWS console with a username and password or access keys so we can programmatically interact with AWS. And when we authenticate to AWS with one of these credentials here, we're hitting the IAM access point, and the IAM access point exists only in US East 1. And then once we hit there, users, again, can optionally have IAM policies. These are the permissions we have within AWS. This is the authorization piece, what we're allowed to do as this user. All right, so the next one was groups. So let's dive into groups. Now, groups are a much simpler concept. They're basically just change the font, a collection of users, of IAM users. So groups don't have credentials, so no credentials. And then really a group is just a way to manage permissions in bulk. for IAM users. So technically, it's not best practice to give permissions directly to a user. Typically, what you want to do is add users to a group which has an IAM policy attached to it, or policies. And then what we're going to do is we'll add users. So these are our IAM users. We got Bob, we got Sally, we've got Jill. And we grant them access to a group. And then this group is what gives Bob, Sally, and Jill over here IAM policies, which again are permissions. So there's no authentication happening here. A group is just a way to manage permissions in bulk for a group of users. Now, if we take out Bob from this group, now Bob no longer has the policies associated with this group. All right, and so then our last type of identity is a role. So roles can be assumed by users and services and other roles. So let's talk about this. So roles have a trust policy, and then roles also have IAM policies. Okay, so the trust policy defines basically who or what can assume the role. And that who or what is going to be a user, a role, or an AWS service. So now let's talk about how the authentication piece works. All right, here's how the authentication piece works. So we basically have a user. I'll use the example for a user, but this would be the same thing as a role or an AWS service. So a user is going to hit this endpoint, and then the endpoint is sts.us east1.amazon.aws.com. Now, with the STS endpoint, unlike IAM, you have different regions. And so this could be US West 2, US West 1, EU North 1, it could be whatever. So this STS service is a regional endpoint. And so what's going to happen here is the user's going to hit this STS endpoint and say, hey, I want to assume this role. So it's going to go to the roles trust policy. And if the user is defined in the trust policy is able to assume the role, then what's going to happen is the STS service will then send back credentials if authorized to assume the role. So that's basically how that works. So you have a user that's already authenticated with AWS. They want to assume the role, so they're going to hit this STS endpoint. And then the trust policy of the role is going to be evaluated and say, hey, is this user allowed to assume the role? If yes, then the STS service sends back credentials to that user. Now, the thing with these credentials here is these are short-term credentials. So this is much better to use a role versus a user where possible, because you get these short-term credentials, which means that they expire, and this is configurable, but it can expire anywhere from like 15 minutes to, I believe, 12 hours. And so this is the key thing, right? If these credentials get exposed, they eventually expire after this time. Whereas with a user, if the credentials get exposed, they last forever. All right, so that's kind of an overview of users, roles, and groups. Understand that best practice is not to use users. We should be using roles wherever possible because, again, they have short-term credentials versus the long-term credentials of users. And then again, groups are just a way to organize your users and give them permissions within AWS. Now I'm going to make some other videos to where we actually get hands-on in the AWS console and on the CLI, and we'll create users, groups, and roles. But hopefully this was a good video to give you an overview of IAM and have a better understanding of how it all works. Thanks for watching.